She was 16 years old, and by the first frost of that October, she had no home, no family, and no one in the world who would claim her. Her uncle, Warren Buell, the only kin left to her after the fever took her parents, stood on the porch of the house that had once been her father's and told her plainly that there was no room in his life, nor in his wife's kitchen, for another mouth that did not belong to his own children. He gave her a canvas sack with 2 dresses folded inside it, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and $2 silver pressed into her palm as though that settled some debt between them. She walked into the town of Larkspur Hollow, Colorado, with those $2, and the world, as far as you could see it, offered her nothing but closed doors and lowered eyes. And yet, before the week was out, she had spent every last cent of what she owned on a rusted, forgotten icehouse at the edge of town that no one else would touch, and sealed inside its frozen dark, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath a false floor, was a ledger that would not only rewrite everything she believed about her own family, but would quietly save an entire town from ruin. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Reyes. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, a place others have written off the way they wrote off her in that Icehouse, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We would love to know we are not so alone in the cold after all. Naomi Reyes had been born in the spring of 1858 in a modest frame house on the eastern edge of Larkspur Hollow, a mining and cattle town cupped in the valley of the Colorado high country, where the mountains rose up steep and blue-shadowed and the winters came down hard and long. Her father, Thomas Reyes, had come north from New Mexico as a young man following the promise of railroad work, and had stayed because he fell in love twice in the same season, once with the valley itself, its clean rivers and its silence, and once with a schoolteacher named Ellen Whitfield, who taught the children of Larkspur Hollow their letters in a one-room schoolhouse with a stove that never drew properly. Thomas was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one, and he had built, plank by plank and season by season, a modest but honest life as a town's ice housekeeper. For in those years before electric refrigeration reached the mountain towns, the man who cut and stored the winter ice and doled it out through the blistering months of July and August held a quiet but essential place in the town's daily survival. Butchers needed him. The doctor needed him to keep medicines cool. The dairyman needed him to keep the milk from turning. And Thomas Reyes took a genuine, unhurried pride in this work, teaching Naomi from the time she could walk to recognize good eyes from bad, to listen to the particular crack and groan of a frozen pond that told you it was ready to be cut, to pack sawdust and straw with a patience that bordered on reverence because, as he told her more times than she could count, what looks like nothing, meja, is very often the thing that keeps everyone else alive. Her mother's contribution to her was quieter but no less permanent. Ellen Reyes kept records. She was a woman who believed, with the same fervor other women brought to their faith, that a thing written down honestly could not be erased by gossip or convenience, and she kept meticulous books, not only of the schoolhouse attendance and the small salary the town paid her, but of debts owed and paid throughout Larkspur Hollow, favors extended, promises made at kitchen tables that men liked to forget once the harvest was in. She taught Naomi her letters early, and more than her letters, she taught her the particular dignity of a ledger, that a column of numbers, kept honestly, was a kind of moral document, a record of who a person truly was when no one else was looking. Numbers don't lie the way people do. Her mother used to say, tracing sums by lamplight with Naomi curled against the side. A man can smile at you in the street and cheat you in his books, but the books themselves never smile. They only tell the truth. This was the inheritance Naomi carried, though she did not yet know its weight. An intimate understanding of ice and cold and patience from her father, and an unshakable respect for the written record from her mother. She grew into a girl who noticed things other people overlooked. The slight give in a floorboard, the different sound a false wall made when you knocked on it, the way a man's eyes shifted when a number didn't sit right with him. She was not beautiful in the way the town's more prosperous daughters were beautiful, with their store-bought ribbons and their soft hands. But she had a steadiness to her, a quality people in Larkspur Hollow noticed even if they didn't remark upon it, the quality of a person who had been taught to look closely at the world and trust what she found there. The fever came through the valley in the late summer of 1874, when Naomi was 16, carried in, some said, by a peddler's wagon that had come up from the lower settlements, though no one could ever prove where it truly began. It moved through Larkspur Hollow with a terrible indifference, taking the very old and the very young first, and then, cruelly, some of the strongest men and women in their prime. Thomas Reyes fell ill on a Tuesday and was dead by the following Monday, and Ellen, who had nursed him through every hour of it without rest, fell on herself 2 days after his burial, as though her body had simply been waiting for permission to stop. Naomi buried both her parents within the space of 11 days, in the small cemetery on the hill above the schoolhouse where her mother had once taught, and she did it with a composure that the townswomen who came to help her whispered about afterward, not entirely as a compliment. Grief, in Naomi, did not look like weeping. It looked like silence, and silence made people uneasy. It was in the weeks after the burials that Warren Buell arrived from Denver, her mother's half-brother, a man Naomi had met perhaps 3 times in her life. Each time at a wedding or a funeral, each time with the same watchful, calculating look in his eye that she had never been able to name until she was older and understood it for what it was, the look of a man assessing what a thing was worth to him. Warren had come, ostensibly, out of family duty, to see to his niece's welfare, but it became clear within days that his true purpose in Larkspur Hollow was the Icehouse itself and the small parcel of land it sat upon, which Thomas Reyes had owned outright and which, upon his death, passed by law and custom into some tangle of guardianship that Warren, with a lawyer's letter and a great deal of solemn talk about what was proper, maneuvered entirely to his own advantage. He sold the Icehouse of Father's Icehouse, the place where she had learned to read the ice and trust the cold, to a Denver land speculator for a sum he never disclosed to her, and he kept every cent of it, framing the whole transaction to Naomi as a kindness, as in relieving her of a burden she could never have managed alone. And then, having settled what he considered his obligation, he told her there was no place for her in his household in Denver, that his wife's nerves could not bear another child underfoot, and he pressed $2 silver into her hand on the porch of the house that was no longer his, and left her standing in the October cold with a canvas sack and nowhere in the world to go. Naomi did not cry in front of him. She had learned, in the 11 days between her parents' deaths, that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend where anyone might see. She took a room for one night at Larkspur Hollow's small boarding house, paying with the loss of her mother's careful hoarding of household coins, and she walked to town the next morning with her $2 silver and the terrible, clarifying knowledge that she had nothing left to lose, which is a kind of freedom, however bitter, that very few people ever truly possess. It was on that walk, past the shuttered mercantile and the blacksmith's forge with a familiar ringing hammer, that she came upon the Icehouse not her father's, for that had been sold away entire, land and building both, before she'd even had the chance to say goodbye to it, but a second, smaller icehouse on the far edge of town, a structure so old and so thoroughly abandoned that most of Larkspur Hollow had forgotten it existed at all. It had belonged, decade before, to a Basque family named Etcheberria who had run a competing ice operation in the town's earlier, rougher years, before Thomas Reyes had built his reputation and his customer base and effectively put the smaller operation out of business through nothing more than honest quality and fair pricing. The Etcheberria family had left Larkspur Hollow sometime in the 1860s, moving on to sheep country further west, and the icehouse they left behind had simply been abandoned, its roof caved in on one corner, its walls stained black with decades of rain and neglect, its heavy door hanging from a single rusted hinge. The land it sat on had passed, through some administrative oversight, into the possession of the town itself, and the town, having no use for a ruined icehouse and even less desire to spend money tearing it down, had simply let it sit, a landmark of failure at the edge of the settled streets, the kind of place children dared each other to enter and then ran from, laughing and frightened, before they'd gone 3 steps inside. Naomi stood before it for a long while that morning. She was aware, in some distant way, of the absurdity of what she was considering a 16-year-old orphan girl, entirely alone, with $2 silver to her name, contemplating the purchase of a ruined building that even the town itself had abandoned. But she was also aware, more sharply, of her father's voice, of years of standing beside him in the cold while he taught her to listen to ice, to trust what her hands and her instincts told her even when the evidence in front of her eyes suggested only ruin. She went to the town clerk's office, a small room attached to the back of the mercantile, and she asked, with a steadiness that surprised even her, what it would take to purchase the old Etcheberria icehouse and its small parcel of land. The clerk, a heavy-set man named Otis Grady who had known her father and had genuine, if awkward, sympathy for her situation, looked at her for a long moment before he answered. He told her the town would be glad to be rid of the liability, that the structure was worth nothing, that he could not in good conscience take more than the $2 for it, and that even that felt to him like taking money from a child. Naomi did not argue the price down further, though she understood he was, in his own clumsy way, offering her a kindness. She placed both silver dollars on the counter, and Otis Grady wrote out a bill of sale in his careful clerk's hand. And just like that, at 16 years old, with nothing left in the world but the clothes on her back and her mother's Bible, Naomi Reyes became the owner of a collapsing, forgotten icehouse on the edge of a town that had already, in its way, forgotten her too. She moved into it that same afternoon, before the cold of the coming night could catch her without shelter. The interior was worse than she had imagined. From the outside, the floor thick with decades of leaves and debris, the walls sagging inward in places, the old ice pit at the center still holding a black, stagnant pool of rainwater that had never properly drained. But there was, in the far corner, a section of the structure that had survived the years better than the rest, where the original builders, men who had understood the science of cold storage, had insulated the wall with a double thickness of timber and packed sawdust between them. And it was here, as she was clearing away rotted debris with her bare hands in the fading afternoon light, trying to find a dry patch of floor where she might spend the night, that her fingers found an irregularity in the planking. It was subtle, the kind of thing only someone who had spent her childhood learning to notice what others overlooked would have caught a seam in the floorboards that ran not with the grain of the construction but against it, a section perhaps 3 feet square that gave, ever so slightly, beneath her palm in a way the surrounding floor did not. She worked at it for the better part of an hour as the light dimmed, prying with a rusted iron bar she found discarded near the old ice tongs, until at last a section of flooring came free all at once, nearly pitching her backward into the darkness, revealing a shallow cavity beneath, dry despite the ruin around it, lined with what remained of old tin sheeting that had kept the damp at bay. And inside that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth that had cracked and yellowed but had held its seal remarkably well across the years, was a ledger. It was not, she saw as she carefully unwrapped it with trembling hands in the last gray light coming through the broken roof. Unlike the ledgers her mother had kept, leather-bound, the pages filled with careful, disciplined handwriting, columns of figures and notations that told, in their quiet way, an entire history. But this was not her mother's hand. It was a different script entirely, sloped and foreign in its letter forms. And as she turned the brittle pages by the loss of the daylight, she began to understand that she was holding the business ledger of the Echeverria family's ice operation, kept faithfully across the years they had run their small competing enterprise in Larkspur Hollow, and woven through it pages, in entries that grew increasingly urgent and increasingly personal toward the ledger's final third, was something far larger than a record of ice sold and debts collected. It was a record of money, substantial money, far beyond what a small ice operation in a mountain town could reasonably be expected to generate, moving in and out of accounts under a name Naomi did not recognize at first, until she found, near the ledger's end, a letter folded into its final pages, addressed not to any Echeverria but to a name that stopped her breath entirely, her own father, Thomas Reyes. The letter was dated 1861, more than a decade before her father's death, written by a man named Bigzent Echeverria, and it laid bare a history Naomi had never known. Before Thomas Reyes had ever built his own ice house and earned his honest reputation in Larkspur Hollow, he had worked, as a young man newly arrived from New Mexico, for the Echeverria family, learning the ice trade from Bigzent himself. And in that letter, written in careful, formal English that was clearly not Bigzent's first language, was a confession and an act of extraordinary trust. The Echeverria family, facing threats from a group of men in town who resented their competition and who had, through intimidation and woes, been trying to force them out of business through means that went well beyond fair commerce, had begun keeping a portion of their earnings hidden and unbanked, fearing that the town's only bank, then, controlled by a consortium of men sympathetic to their rivals, would find some pretext to seize their assets or deny them credit entirely. Bigzent had entrusted young Thomas, not yet an owner himself, not yet a rival, simply a hard-working employee he had come to trust like a son, with a knowledge of where this hidden reserve was kept in case anything should happen to the Echeverria family before they could act on their long-held plan, to use that money not merely for themselves, but to establish a fund for Larkspur Hollow's working families, a kind of mutual aid society that would help widows, orphans, and families ruined by bad seasons or worse luck, an idea Bigzent had brought with him from cooperative traditions in his homeland and had hoped, one day, to see rooted in this new country too. But the Echeverria family had left Larkspur Hollow suddenly, in circumstances the ledger's final entries only hinted at, increasing threats, a barn burned, livestock poisoned, and in their hurried departure for safer country further west, the letter to Thomas, meant to guide him to the hidden funds and entrust him with completing the plan, had never been delivered. It had been left behind, sealed with the ledger itself, hidden beneath that false floor for safekeeping until Big Zen could send word that, for reasons the ledger could not explain, had simply never come. Thomas Reyes had gone on to build his own Icehouse without ever knowing of this letter, without ever knowing that his old employer had meant to entrust him with a sum of money and a purpose that could have changed the shape of his entire life, and the entire town's, more than a decade before his death. Naomi sat in the near darkness of that ruined Icehouse with the ledger open in her lap and wept for the first time since her parents had died, not from grief alone now, but from the staggering vertigo of discovering a hidden thread running beneath the entire fabric of a family's history, a thread that connected her, through her father's forgotten years of quiet service and trust, to a fortune that had been waiting, sealed and patient, for over a decade for someone to come and finish what Big Zen Etsaberia had started. The ledger's final pages contained something more practical than sentiment. However, a set of careful notations, half code and half plain description, indicating precisely where the hidden funds themselves were secured. Not in the Icehouse at all, Naomi realized as she puzzled over the entry by candlelight over the following days, but beneath the floor of the old Etsaberia family barn, which had burned in the troubles described in the letter but whose stone foundation she discovered upon. Walking the overgrown property at the town's edge, still stood largely intact, hidden now beneath years of encroaching brush. It took her the better part of a week, working in secret in the early mornings before the town was fully stirring, to clear enough of the foundation to find what the ledger described, a sealed iron strongbox buried beneath a flagstone in the old foundation, containing gold coin, silver certificates long since needing to be exchanged for current currency, and a formal deed to a parcel of land at the center of town that Big Zen Etsaberia had purchased specifically, the ledger explained, to serve as the site of the mutual aid hall he had dreamed of building. The sum, once Naomi carefully totaled it using the very ledger-keeping skills her mother had taught her, was enormous to a girl who had owned nothing but $2 silver a fortnight before enough. She understood with a kind of trembling awe, not merely to rebuild her father's Icehouse and reclaim some version of her old life, but to do something far larger, something that honored both the debt her father had unknowingly carried, and the vision Big Zen Etsaberia had never gotten the chance to build. Word of Naomi's discovery could not, of course, remain secret for long in a town the size of Larkspur Hollow, and it reached the ears of exactly the man who had the most reason to fear it. Silas Pruitt, now the town's most prominent banker, a man in his 50s whose father had been among the very consortium of men who had, according to the ledger's darker implications, orchestrated the threats and violence that drove the Etsaberia family from town in the first place, seizing their customer base and their standing for the benefit of their own competing interests. Silas Pruitt had inherited both his father's bank and, it seemed, his father's instinct for consolidating advantage, and when he learned that an orphan girl with no legal standing and no family to advise her had unearthed a fortune with a legitimate claim tracing back to a family his own had helped drive out, he moved quickly and coldly to challenge her ownership of it, first through the courts, arguing that any property found on town land for the old Etsaberia homestead had, like the Icehouse, reverted to municipal ownership over the years, belonged rightfully to Larkspur Hollow itself, meaning, in practice, to the town council that Pruitt himself effectively controlled through debt and influence. For weeks that autumn, Naomi found herself the subject of a legal and social battle far beyond anything a 16-year-old orphan should have had to fight alone. Pruitt's lawyers argued in the modest courthouse that she had no standing, that she was a minor, that the ledger and letter proved nothing but the ravings of a foreign family's paranoid bookkeeping. But Naomi had inherited more than a ledger from her parents. She had inherited her mother's unshakable faith in the written record and her father's patient refusal to be moved by intimidation. She sought out Otis Grady, the town clerk who had sold her the Icehouse, and together they traced the original land records proving the Etsaberia family had purchased both the barn parcel and the town center lot legitimately, decades before, records that had simply been buried in dusty municipal files that no one had bothered consulting years. She wrote, with her mother's careful hand, letters to the county seat and even to a surviving Etsaberia cousin she managed to locate through a sheep-ranching contact in the Western Territories, who confirmed the family's history and, remarkably, formally relinquished any competing claim in Naomi's favor, writing that Big Zen, before his death some years prior in his new home, had always spoken with regret of the young man he'd trusted and never been able to reach, and would have wanted his intentions honored by whoever finally uncovered them. It was Otis Grady's testimony, and the plain, undeniable way to the original ledger itself, laid open before the town's small court, that finally turned public sentiment. The people of Larkspur Hollow, many of whom had their own quiet memories of the Echeverria family's fair dealing, and more than a few of whom carried old debts to Silas Pruitt's bank that made them privately resentful of his growing power, began to see the case not as a legal technicality but as a moral one, a chance, long overdue, to right an old and buried wrong. The judge, a circuit rider with no particular loyalty to Pruitt's interests, ruled in Naomi's favor, affirming her legal right to the recovered funds as a rightful heir to her father's trusted position and the documented intentions of the letter itself. Naomi did not, in the end, use a fortune to rebuild her father's Icehouse alone and retreat into private comfort, though she could have, and no one in Larkspur Hollow would have begrudged her that choice after everything she had endured. Instead, honoring the vision she had found sealed in oilcloth beneath a rutted floor, she used the recovered funds to purchase and construct, on the very town center lot Big Zen Echeverria had set aside for the purpose decade before, a mutual aid hall exactly as he had once dreamed. A building that provided small emergency loans to widows and struggling families at fair terms, that stored surplus grain and goods against hard winters, and that stood, quite deliberately, only a short walk from Silas Pruitt's bank, a plain and constant reminder of an alternative to the kind of cold, extractive power his family had built their fortune upon. She rebuilt the old Icehouse too, not as a private business this time, but as a shared community resource, its ice available to any family in Larkspur Hollow who could not otherwise afford to keep food or medicine cool through the brutal months of summer, run on the same principle of fair and honest service her father had taught her as a girl. Silas Pruitt, stripped of the moral high ground his family had occupied for 2 generations and increasingly shunned by townspeople who now understood the fuller history of how his family's fortune had truly been built, so his influence over Larkspur Hollow quietly but steadily eroded over the following years, his bank losing customers to the very mutual aid hole he had tried to prevent from existing, until he eventually sold his interests and left the valley altogether, a departure that occasioned no farewells and very few regrets. And so we returned to where we began, to a 16-year-old girl standing on a porch that was no longer haze, holding $2 silver in a canvas sack, cast out by an uncle who saw her only as a burden to be settled and forgotten. Naomi Reyes could not have known, standing in that October cold, that the very smallness of what she possessed, $2, a ruined building nobody wanted, a name that carried no weight in Larkspur Hollow's ledgers of power, was about to become the instrument of a restoration far larger than her own survival. She did not find a fortune because she was lucky. She found it because she had been taught, patiently and without fanfare, by 2 people who loved her, to notice what others walked past, to trust the seam in the floorboard that didn't match the grain, to believe that a written record, kept honestly, could outlast even the men who tried to bury it. What looked, to the town of Larkspur Hollow, like a foolish girl throwing away her lost coins on a ruin, was in truth an act of quiet faith in her father's steady hands, in her mother's careful columns of numbers, in the idea that value does not announce itself loudly but waits, patient as eyes through a long winter, for someone willing to look closely enough to find it. Naomi Reyes lived the rest of her long life in Larkspur Hollow, and in time she became, in her own quiet way, something like what Big Zen Echeverria had once hoped to be for the town himself, not its richest resident, but its steadiest. The woman families turned when the wolf came close to the door, the keeper of both ice and honest ledgers, the living proof that the things the world discards as worthless are so very often the things holding, in secret, everything a community needs to endure. Thank you for staying with us through Naomi's story tonight. If it moved you even a little, we would be so grateful if you would share it with someone who might need a reminder that what looks like ruin is sometimes only waiting to be uncovered. We would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had written off? A person, a place, or perhaps even yourself. We read every one of your stories, and they mean more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close.